Welcome to the State of the Markets podcast. I'm Paul Rodriguez of thinktrading.com.
I'm Tim Price of pricevaluepartners.com.
And our very special guest is Patrick Fagan. Patrick Fagan is an applied behavioral scientist and data psychologist, Sunday Times best-selling author, part-time university lecturer, and former lead psychologist at Cambridge Analytica, not the political arm. He's the mind behind books like Hooked, Free Your Mind, and Tech Gods, and helps brands from eBay to Vodafone turn psychological insight into real-world impact. Patrick Fagan, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure. So you're a behavioral psychologist. Could you explain what that is, please?
Yeah, I'd like to say my slogan to clients is that I turn minds into money. So I take the academia of psychology and think about how to apply it for real world outcomes, so commercial outcomes usually, also political campaigns as well. But behavioral science really is making a science of behavior. I know it sounds obvious, but it's starting with the end in mind in terms of having a behavior to change, and then taking a scientific kind of observable mechanical way of doing that, of changing behavior. And there's a psychological aspect to it, of course, which is understanding the why, which can be a bit more nebulous, the underlying motives and decision-making processes and things. But the ultimate aim is to change a behavior through intervention, so some kind of change in the environment, what's often colloquially called nudges, these often small environmental changes that in theory can have a big behavioral impact, like a quite obvious or popular example is social proof. So if there's two restaurants and one of them seems very, very busy and the other one's completely deserted, most people would choose the busy one. Not me, because I'm an introvert, but most people would choose the busy one. And that's a basic nudge, really. If something appears to be popular, we assume it must be good, but that's not always the case, as I'm sure you know.
Isn't that just human behavior has led towards that being the correct choice, and that's why we default to it?
Yeah, absolutely. So they're called biases. It's called, being irrational, but actually these are shortcuts that have evolved over thousands or millions of years, and actually they are useful most of the time. So following the crowd is generally useful most of the time. If everybody's running away and screaming, you should probably do that too. If you
Right.
take the time to stop and think and work out what's going on, it could be fatal. Um, but they don't always lead us down the right path. And a nice um, kind of analogy is moths use light for navigation, and for a long time that was great and fine for them, but now there's candles and light bulbs. It can kind of be a bit dangerous for them, and it's the same for us, I suppose. We have these hardwired things which generally are useful, but in certain situations or now that the times have changed, they might actually be maladaptive.
So how did you get into this in the first place? From starting from school and finding this as a subject that you wanted to make your career?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up chicks. That's the truth of it. I'm not proud of
Brilliant.
that.
Brilliantly
Well, a little
honest.
bit proud of that,
So is
but
this
yeah.
where the mind control comes in?
Right.
Darren Brown stuff.
Exactly. So I was about 17 or 18. I was really interested in the game. If you recall that book, that there was that whole kind of looking back quite cringe subculture around essentially using psychology to be more attractive as a man. People ask me often if it worked, and I say, "Well, I'm married now, so no." Um,
Great
but
answer.
I learned a lot about psychology from it. Funnily enough, it really had some good foundation in body language and archetypes and non-verbal processes and evolutionary psychology. So that's kind of how I got interested in the first place. So I did psychology then at UCL, and then I wanted to figure out how to make money from it. So I did a master's in marketing. And if I do ever figure it out, I'll let you know. I tried to be in a band, didn't work out. And then I was on to nudging, really. I went straight into my first job where we were nudging people to buy a certain brand of cat food in supermarkets by putting pictures of cats in the aisle, which seems obvious, but no one else was doing it. And it grabbed attention because cats are relevant, obviously, but also they're cute. And we're hardwired to pay attention to cute things for obvious evolutionary reasons. And they were different as well, so they just stood out. So all of these things grabbed attention and increased sales for that brand.
But I mean, cats themselves don't actually buy the stuff, so it needs to appeal to
Mm.
humans as well. Would it be fair to say you're familiar with the work of Rory Sutherland then?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, he does.
absolutely. Yeah,
He
Rory's
does nudge stuff.
great.
Yeah,
He's given me a couple of quotes for my books, actually.
yeah. So you, talking of which, you wrote, co-wrote a book called A State of Fear with Laura Dodsworth, and well, you've also written a recent book, Hooked, and another one that we want to get onto that you haven't released is Tech God. So this is going to be a fantastic bundle that I'm going to be getting into. But talking of Laura Dodsworth and A State of Fear, obviously going back to the lockdown and how the government were trying to influence our behaviour. Perhaps you could just tell us a bit about what the government were doing.
So the government were, noble intentions or otherwise, who knows, but they were using very, very much using behavioral science to change people's behavior, really, of course. So they had a unit called SPY-B, which was their behavioral science unit that reported to SAGE, the scientific advisory group. And I mean, really, you can move for behavioral science nudges during that period. There were, for example, the famous Look Them in the Eyes campaign, which is a very classic use of what's called protection motivation theory, which says if you want people to do a protective behavior, like quit smoking, or in this case, wear a mask, or whatever it might be, you need two levers. One is fear. So you need people to think they're at high risk of something happening, and that if it does happen, the outcome will be severe. So you need kind of an emotional motivation, and negative ones tend to be more effective. Fear is the oldest and strongest emotion. But the other lever is efficacy, which is you can't just work people up. Need to kind of work them up and then give them an outlet or a direction for that kind of pent up emotion they're feeling. So you need to give them a very clear route of action. And so they need to feel that they can do it. And if they do it, it will work. And so look them in the eyes and tell them you always wear a mask. It has this negative emotion of look them in the eyes. You have fear and guilt and anxiety being worked up in people. And then it says, and then tell them you always wear a mask, which is the efficacy. So you're kind of winding people up and then pointing them in a direction. So that was just one example. There are many, many others in the way the data was presented, for example. Um, uh, Cases, daily cases in absolute terms, or deaths in absolute terms rather than per capita terms, which would have made it a lot less frightening. If we'd had a daily news count saying 99% of people who caught COVID survived today, and we saw that every day, I think the public reaction would have been very different. So there were all these kind of nudges used in messaging and the presentation of data and even strategy. Laura spoke to someone in government who said that the point of masks was to soften people up for lockdowns. That's what's called the foot in the door technique, or I think colloquially called the totalitarian tiptoe, for example, that you can't, if you want to take people to the lobby, you have to take them through the penthouse first. So it's all about doing things in small increments to, as that person told Laura, soften people up. So many, many other examples, I'm sure, but they definitely had dedicated behavioral scientists working on this.
Well, a skeptic would say the mask psyop was to remind people that there was a pandemic, so otherwise you wouldn't have noticed.
Yeah, exactly. So making it concrete, because otherwise it would be very abstract. People weren't falling in the street and dying. It's really just very much based on data and a bit ambiguous. If you had a cold, was it COVID? Maybe,
Well, it was
maybe
it was
not.
it was in part fueled by ridiculous modelling by a discredited modeler.
Yes. Yeah, you don't have to tell me that. Yeah, I'm quite surprised that they would keep weaning him out after every forecast he's ever made has been grossly wrong.
After you see sort of piles of dead cows burnt in the fields, and you think maybe he's overstepped the market again.
Just for people who don't know that reference, that was the reference to mad cow disease that was completely wrong, and various other ones. So there were certain people who were very skeptical quite early on in the pandemic and looking at the data. And I wonder whether Tim and I have got financial backgrounds, and because you work in the city, you have or have worked in the city, you have a certain skepticism for
What you
has
might
been
call a
told.
bullshit detector.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. You need that because in markets, it's really important. You know, if the CEO is saying this is a fantastic company and the government's saying everything's okay, we know not to trust that. And when it comes to something as big as a pandemic, you're naturally skeptical, and then you would just do research and look into the details. And it seemed the more details you looked into, the less it made sense. And it was well, I guess it's not the right word to say an interesting mind experiment, but it was incredible to see how it kind of divided people into people who just blindly trusted the government and people who were just skeptical and saying, look, I'm not sure that this is right, and how those voices were shouted down very aggressively, especially on social media and other ways of controlling people who had a different view. And you know, we had a lot of skeptical people on the podcast, and to be quite honest with you, it really hit in terms of the algorithm, because of course, that will not be
Mm.
promoted, but we'd rather do the right thing. So when you see something like that, when you see the messaging that you can clearly see is nudging you, how do you naturally then rail against it and say, oh, I can see they're trying to make me do that, even perhaps if it was something that was to your benefit?
Um, I'll just say that there's an interesting point there. So I did a project for I know it's quite different, but I did a project for a gaming site, and found that the only personality predictor of revenue was agreeableness, but where disagreeable people made more money from the site, or at least lost less. And I have a friend who does it for a living, and he says his rule of thumb, crudely, is just figure out what everyone else is doing and do the opposite.
Yeah.
Um, and it's probably, I assume, some kind of parallels there with finance, where following the crowd perhaps is not always the right thing to do. But I've been really interested in what these personality traits are that were linked to skepticism at that time. And I think disagreeableness is definitely one of those, which often gets painted as a bad thing, but I think actually very much can be a good thing. You know, if all the lemmings are going off the cliff, it's probably better to not do that. Um, but to your question about railing against it, it's tricky because there was this great book on brainwashing after World War II. It was written after World War II, which talked about Pavlov's dogs, the experiments, and he said the only dogs that Pavlov couldn't train were those who just ignored the bell in the first place. I think the danger is if you're railing against things, you're still reacting to them and you're still getting emotionally worked up by them. It's a bit like a bull that chases a red cloth so much that eventually it gets tired and can be kind of taken down. I've seen people who are very skeptical about lockdowns. But then the next kind of news story comes along and they seem to be completely won over by it. So I'm just wondering, maybe railing against it, against manipulation actively and energetically might not be the way. And it might be better just to more kind of switch off and
Mm.
disengage. And even mindfulness can be very helpful. There's actually peer-reviewed research on how practicing mindfulness can make you less susceptible to cognitive biases. So I think actually, in some, just chilling out a bit might be more the answer.
Are you familiar with a book called 180 Degrees: Unlearn the Lies You've Been Taught to Believe?
Yeah,
The
sounds
author's
interesting there.
it's very interesting. I'd say it's one of the most interesting books I've ever read. And the author's the pseudonym, I don't know the name of the author, but the pseudonymous name of the author is Fergus O'Connor Greenwood. And we've had Fergus on the pod, And we asked him the question about, what was it that let's say made more people susceptible to questioning the COVID narrative than others. And his answer was he felt strongly that, I mean, he acknowledged our suggestion that it was, for example, people in finance have a higher level of skepticism generally about the
Yeah.
world.
Hmm.
And his answer was that people who were less trusting of the government messaging had a higher level of emotional intelligence rather than general intelligence, IQ. So EQ
Hmm.
rather than IQ.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I've often seen these studies about IQ, but I think they're misinterpreted, and I think it's more that people who are skeptical are more in touch with their gut instinct. So there are these questions. It's called the cognitive reflection test, and they're basically brain teasers. So things like, probably heard this one, but a bat and a ball cost £1.10. The
Everyone
bat,
gets the price wrong.
yes, and so together they cost £1.10. The bat costs £1 more than the ball. How much is the ball? And so your immediate gut response is to say it's 10 pence. But the right response, if you stop and think about it, is 5 pence. But there's in that very specific, unusual case of being asked a brain teaser, okay, it's better to like think about things and not go with your gut. But generally in life, actually, probably is better to go with your gut and you make better decisions if you go with your gut or at least listen to it as well as thinking. Whereas, as Orwell kind of said, there are some things so absurd only an intellectual can believe them. And it's people who are not in touch with their gut and who can get lost down these kind of rabbit holes. They're able to convince themselves of anything, like convince themselves a man can get pregnant or whatever, based on intellectual thought because they're not really in touch with their gut instinct.
Because because psychology is so linked to the financial markets, and as you were saying earlier about doing the opposite is often the right thing to do. We have an expression for that. It's called contrary opinion theory, and because of that, I've been fascinated by psychology right from day one, and how that shapes people's decisions in trading and et cetera, et cetera. So what sort of techniques have you seen that the brain is basically being influenced by marketing and like for example, I've heard you mention something called the brain bouncer that
Yeah.
you need to get past. Tell us a bit about that and how that works.
Well, when we're talking about marketing and advertising, um, there are basically two things, very interconnected things a brand wants to do, and that is get inside your head and be connected to as many things as possible in your memory and also be connected to the right things. So you can kind of think of memory as a interconnected network of nodes, a bit like a spider web. And activation ripples out from one node to the things connected to it. So, for example, if you see a table, the table node in your memory lights up, and then that ripples out to things connected to it through association, like chair or plate and dinner, etc. Um, and so a brand wants to be connected to the to as many things as possible in memory because that's going to trigger remembering the brand and therefore buying it. And also, we just like things more that we feel familiar with and we're aware of. It's called the mere exposure effect. The more you see something, the more you like it, the more you believe it's really true, the more likely you will be to notice it in the supermarket next time you're there. So being front of mind is very important, and also connected to the right things. So a great example is Coca-Cola have that famous Christmas advert, and that makes perfect sense for Coca-Cola because Christmas is happy, it's sociable, and it's cold. And so now when you think Coca-Cola, you'll think cold, you'll think happy and sociable. So that's it in a nutshell, what brands want to achieve. And then to do that, they have to grab your attention and be memorable. And there is a network in the brain that's called the brain's bouncer. So if you think of conscious awareness as a very, very small VIP room or VIP lounge that not much information is allowed in. One estimate says we're only consciously aware of 0.0004% of everything around us. It is a guess, but the vast majority of everything we're not consciously aware of. And so what we are consciously aware of, we have to be very judicious about that because we only have limited brain power to pay attention to it. And so this bouncer decides what we should pay attention to. So if you imagine you're in a noisy cocktail party, and for the sake of argument, imagine your name is Bob, and you're talking and there's dozens of conversations happening around you. All of a sudden, you hear across the room someone say to their friend, "Oh, I've always hated Bob." You'll hear that whole sentence, even though you weren't listening to that person. And even though the word Bob comes at the very end of it, you'll still hear the whole thing. And this is called the cocktail party effect, and it's taken as evidence that your brain is processing all of those conversations, everything around you at a very low level, and then directing your conscious awareness to that which is deemed to be most important by the brain's bouncer. And the bouncer has a VIP list of things that immediately get into conscious awareness, including personalization. So if you hear your name or you see your name, you pay attention to it. Also, as I said earlier, cuteness. If you've ever seen someone bring a baby or a puppy onto a bus or a tube train, you'll see everyone turn their head and look. We pay attention to novelty. So if you see a robot dog walk into a room, one of those dystopian robot dogs that are conventional, something everyone wants to look at it because it's new. So surprise is something we pay attention to. Food for obvious evolutionary reasons, faces, sex, and of course emotion, including fear. Fear is probably the most attention-grabbing one, but also disgust, etc., etc. And so brands use, or ideally, if they want to be effective, should use these things to grab attention and be remembered.
So I can't remember how long ago it was, but I saw the documentary "The Century of the Self" by Adam Curtis, which really shaped my understanding of exactly what lengths companies will go to influence our behavior. It is quite astonishing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's been going on for much longer than we think. People have seen the tech companies and AI and all that, and how the algorithm gives us what we want and all that, and they can see it now. But the roots of this go back a long way.
Yeah, I mean, at least 100 years ago, you had Gustave Le Bon writing The Crowd, which was about how to manipulate large masses of people. And he said essentially the same thing that advertisers do these days, which is don't engage people rationally. You need to pick one single point. You need to say it loudly and boldly, and you just need to say it again and again and again. And then you have Edward Bernays, who literally wrote a book called Propaganda. He was kind of the founder of modern um, propaganda and PR and marketing, public relations, and he wrote this book, yeah, nearly 100 years ago as well, I think.
Well, this suggests that human nature doesn't really change. I remember someone pointing out that everyone complains about you go on a tube these days and everyone's got their head plastered to a smartphone, and it's like what's happened to humanity. And then you only have to go back 50 years, and everyone will have their face plastered to a broadsheet newspaper. So it's different technology, but the same sort of human wiring.
Yeah, so Aldous Huxley said man has an infinite appetite for distraction. We're always trying to kind of escape really our circumstances and our stress. Although I would argue that obviously the medium has changed a lot, and a broadsheet is static text which you can kind of digest and think about, and you have more of a richer, slower reflection on that information. Whereas phones, their video, which is kind of bombarding you with, an image is 1,000 words. How many words is a video, so to speak? So it's bombarding you with that information. And there was actually a study where they had people consuming news content, and they found if it was through that kind of CNN format, especially with the chevron of rolling information at the bottom, they're bombarding people with so much information that they were less likely to critically evaluate it and to just accept it, because there's only so much we can really carefully pay attention to. And there was another study as well. This was just looking at television. I think in Canada, they were looking at people's political attitudes, and people who read newspapers for their news had more stable political beliefs over time versus those who watched TV. Their beliefs fluctuated more. Um, so I take your point. We're always trying to distract ourselves and have our heads glued to something, but I do think there is a psychological effect that's different with screens versus reading.
I understand that the music industry have invested so much money in instead of like in the old days, they would find bands and they would invest in a band, and it may or may not work, and that's why we've had all the great bands of past, but now we just seem to have kind of manufactured individuals who are set on this career because the way they decided to invest their money is in marketing. And so instead they'll get someone to write a song, they'll get someone to front that song, and then they'll just spend a lot of money playing it over and over and over again on the radio. Whether the song's good or not, it doesn't really matter up to a certain extent, as long as they just keep
brute force repetition.
As long as they keep playing it. What is the psychological technique that they are using there, apart from just obviously putting it in front of us all the time?
Um, well, I mean, it's still happening, I think, with just influencer marketing now instead. So these tracks are being used by influencers on TikTok and being paid to do that. Um, but the effect that's happening is one is, as I said earlier, the mere exposure effect, where the more you hear something or consume something, the more familiar it feels, the more you like it. So there was a study where Western people were shown Chinese letters, Chinese ideographs, and some of them they saw more frequently and some not at all. And then later they were quizzed which ones they recognized, and they didn't really recognize any of them, even if they've seen them before. But then they were also asked how much do you like them, and they liked the ones more if that they had seen before. So things that just are familiar, we like more. And especially with music, it's designed to be catchy and to get stuck in your head. So even when you're not listening to it, you are kind of subconsciously listening to it. If you wake up in the morning with the tune stuck in your head, in theory, it's been being played all night. That's and on old MK Ultra, a technique called psychic driving. Just if you keep hearing something on repeat again and again and again, it's going to influence how you think. But also, it's probably an authority appeal. So if something is played on the radio or if it's used by an influencer in a TikTok, you assume it must be good. Um, Edward Bernays said this that influence follows a kind of trickle down pyramid where we follow those in charge of our subculture or our group, and we assume that if they have given something the seal of approval, it must be good or right.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I also noticed something very early on when YouTube came along, and as a musician, I liked. I'm into guitar, and I would watch videos of people, talking about various equipment and what have you. And I realized very early on, I don't know if there's a name for this, but I kind of called it the spotlight effect, where if somebody was saying, "Oh, look, this is a really great guitar," and they were playing it and showing how great the guitar was, and you were listening to it and watching it and thinking, "Oh, that sounds really great," but you weren't focusing on the amp, which is obviously a really important part of it, or a pedal, and therefore, so they're saying, "Oh, that's a really great guitar," and that makes you want to buy it, and I was thinking, well, hang on a minute. That really makes me want to buy it, but we're not talking about the amp. And then in some other videos, they'd be talking about the amp and saying, this is a really great amp, and they're not talking about the guitar. And
it goes all the way up to 11.
It goes all the way up to 11. It was a really interesting psychological kind of. Obviously, they're not trying to manipulate you in that sense, but it's where you were spotlighting your focus on. Is there something in science that says why we kind of ignore the other stuff and focus on just on that one thing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's called focalism. And yeah, we can only really hold one thing in our heads at any one time. You see this in the news cycle, how obsessed people were over that submarine that imploded, and how long that lasts, about a week, and then it's on to the next thing. No one ever thinks or talks about it again. And also it's used as a nudge. So if you direct people to the attribute that you want people to buy the product based on, they will. So there was a study in Los Angeles when they released hygiene gradings for restaurants. The revenue of A-rated restaurants increased significantly because here's a new metric that people are now using to judge their decisions based on. Um, it's a bit like a magician, the magician directs your attention somewhere and you think the trick will happen there and you're trying to work out what it is. Meanwhile, actually the trick is happening behind their back or something where you're not looking. So yeah, the spotlight is absolutely right. It is actually called the attentional spotlight in psychology. So you can only focus really on one tiny, tiny slice of the world around us.
That is fascinating. Tim, I've got loads of questions, but I don't want to hog the mic. So if you want to jump in.
To go back to the business of, say, groupthink or herd following, it strikes me that in the investment world, there are actually two ways you can try and exploit that. The first, and probably comes down to timing. So the first thing is, if there's a trend in something developing, it pays to be part of that trend, provided
Mhm.
that you get out in time, basically at
Yeah.
the top. So there comes a point where you exploit the trend for, let's say, 90% of its move, and then if you have the foresight or the luck or the ability to identify the top, then you get skeptical in a hurry. And that's probably the optimum way to adjust to big to capitalize on big trends in markets, where in whatever facet of the market that might be, whether it's currency, bonds, stocks, meme stocks, whatever.
But it's still kind of going against the grain, I guess, at the beginning because you're being an early
Well,
adopter, right?
you're probably trying to fight your instincts for the majority of the trend if you're part of it, because you
Mm,
realize it's greater fool theory that's dictating the movement, but it's such a powerful trend that you want to be on it for as long as you can.
mm. Yeah, I do know that at least for entrepreneurialism, one of the biggest drivers of success is the ability to recognize and act on opportunities. So I think extroversion is actually quite a good predictor of success in these kind of areas. And I don't think it's really so much about being sociable and outgoing, but actually having energy and kind of will to power, if you like. So actually acting on things and being decisive, actually, I think is a huge thing, and making things happen.
I think that's a really interesting, area that you're talking about there, Tim, because in terms of psychology, the way I see it is that when something is trending or that you get the beginning of a trend, very often it will be a contrary thing because at the start of it, for example, let's take the example of Netflix and blockbusters. So when blockbusters are around or whatever that technology is, if you start talking about Netflix, they're like, well, what's that? I don't know. That sounds like pie in the sky stuff. What's this internet stuff? That's never going to work. And then as it's taking hold, people generally think that they've either missed the move or they're still very skeptical. They won't move over. Crypto's a great example of that. How initially people will say this is bad and ignore it, and then we're still in this phase where it's not been adopted. Then there will be a phase where everybody's suddenly all in, and that's where you switch again, and it's contrary to then get out. So I think the psychology in trends is fascinating because the market always looks like it's too high, and that's what I observe when my background is Patrick is as a what's called a chartist or a technical analyst, which is kind of it uses charts, but it's also very much involved in psychology and what people are doing when at various parts of the trend and how they are interpreting data and the markets at various stages. So, for example, the government always say that the economy's really bad, yet the stock market is making new highs. And that disparity is telling you that people will probably be out of the stock market in the best times, even though the market is telling you actually this is going up. So it appears all the time, and it's very fast. It's a fascinating area. I wonder whether that's something that you'd consider spending more time actually studying the markets as opposed to using it for marketing.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really interested. I mean, I'm a amateur investor. My best performing investment has been gold. In 2020, I just bought a whole bunch of gold.
Now,
I
why
won't
why
tell you
did you
about.
do that? That's a really interesting call.
Just because I guess I had this prediction, looking forward. I mean, there are two things. One is if you just get people to stay at home and close most of the economy and print money to give them 80% of their salary, then money is meaningless. And so there needs to be some other kind of store of value. And gold is just kind of the safest, most a trusted store of value, I suppose. And then secondly, I had this kind of looking back, quite irrational fear that everything would collapse and the banks would they would do bail-ins and everything would close. They'd be run on the banks. So I needed to have some kind of physical store of value to hand that I could use to keep going through those times.
And you were you were looking at crypto as well, weren't you? You still investing in that area?
Yeah, I do dollar cost averaging. So every week I buy a bit of crypto and or just Bitcoin. Really, it's working out. I would like to get into meme coins, but I think it's a lot of work to be able to spot those opportunities before they take off. I don't know if you've had any luck with it.
I've seen. I don't trade meme coins just because they're basically meme coins and they're just a bit crazy. You've got to be
Yeah,
at your screen all day long and just do it all day. I mean,
exactly. Yeah.
the percentage moves are amazing, and yeah, it's sort of the sort of thing you could just do. But I choose to stay out of it, to be honest. But and I don't want to speak for Tim, but I'm pretty much sure that that's not something you'd be investing in, Tim.
It wouldn't qualify as an investment. It doesn't mean I'm not sympathetic. As a libertarian, I'm very sympathetic to the story of the narrative around cryptocurrency generally. But if it's this, as Benjamin Graham would have stipulated, there's a distinction between speculation and investment, and the crypto stuff is too speculative for us. And also, the authorities make it impossible for us to buy it anyway. So even if we wanted to, we couldn't.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're putting money every certain period into into crypto. It's actually hard to do that. And I've heard of people's, banks telling them they got to close their
Yeah,
accounts because of it.
it just happened to me.
Oh no,
That
really?
my account didn't get closed, but the payments keep failing. It's very frustrating, but I guess it's the competition for banks, right? So they don't want people using it.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And so yeah, actually, on the meme coins, I think what's interesting about that is when they all go absolutely bonkers. It'll be a bit like the tech boom we had in 99 2000 and then the crash. It will be like everybody will be all in on crypto, and that is when we'll see the big crash. And the first to go will be the meme coins, because it's usually the it was the stocks that had the least behind them that crashed first. And meme coins obviously have nothing behind them. So just for people who don't know what a meme coin is, it's a cryptocurrency that's created for the purpose of just existing, and it has absolutely nothing behind it other than its name and its popularity. And the more people who can push it, and by this kind of effect of the more you see it, the more you think perhaps I should buy some. Definitely a bubble, definitely an indication of a time that we're going to look back and say it wasn't that crazy. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of money to be made, but you just have to be careful of investing too much in it and getting caught out right at the top.
Absolutely.
And obviously Trump was involved with that as well, so
Mm.
which is not was not very it didn't do his political status much good, I think, within the trading community. It wasn't the best thing to do.
No, he made a lot though, didn't he?
Yeah, I guess he doesn't care. He's making so much money, and there's a lot. I mean, talking of Trump, it just reminds me of the kind of Trump. I was very pleased that he got in on the basis of the fact that it looked like, this kind of crazy woke agenda that said that a man can get pregnant and all these sorts of things that just seemed like, what is going on to critical thinkers out there. It's just like, you can see why there's been this backlash, and it just seemed like the governments here and there didn't seem to understand it. He came in and he seemed to undo all of the men in women's sports and trans etc. that was clearly dangerous in some cases. That was a really positive thing. What is there something that the government was psychologically trying to do? I mean, it's almost like they were trying to make their people angry from this stuff. I can't get my head around why they were doing it.
Um, yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, it all roads do seem to point to kind of destabilizing the family and these kind of traditional things that people secure themselves to, family, religion, community. Because when people are atomized and disconnected, they're easier to control. But I don't know if that necessarily means, and even kind of disconnected from gender, people are easier to shape when they're fluid, I think would be the best way to put it. So there
Wow.
seemed to be a kind of move and shift to make people fluid and disconnected um, from the past and from I guess biological reality and yeah, as I say, make them fluid. But I don't know if that's a deliberate conspiracy or if that's just the shape of things. I think I mean, not to get religious about it, but in the Bible it talks about, I don't know the exact quote, but it's we're not we're not fighting men and women, we're fighting powers and principalities. Like I think there are these potentially powers and principalities which are big collective kind of forces, almost like the seasons, but they're big social forces that come and go, are forces of dissolution and rebuilding. You probably, I'm sure, of course, you know about Ray Dalio,
Yeah.
these I think Ages of Discord he wrote, but also The Fourth Turning is also a popular book. So it's basically the same thing that these cycles of dissolve and rebuild go in time over about the span of 100 years. Um, so I think we're coming out of that dissolving phase now, kind of potentially seeing the shoots of spring, so to speak. I don't know if it's necessarily a big grand conspiracy. I think it's just, as I said, like a natural cycle, a natural force.
Well, it does seem like the government wants to take control of the family in the sense like as an individual, the government wants to be your family. It wants to look after you. It wants to take that role kind of and I don't know what, as I say, I don't know whether that's intentional.
Well, the big state wants to replace the family, so you have no trust in the family unit, you have no trust in a Christian God, you have trust in the state and nothing else.
Yeah, I mean that's what it seemed. It really does seem like that. Based on, and now you've said that about the woke agenda and how the fluid kind of mindset is more malleable. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The state wants to take over the family. So I have two young boys, and I'm thinking about primary schools now for the eldest. I'm kind of looking into it, and oh, I was talking to
That's
ChatGPT.
not an envious position to be in necessarily.
No, and ChatGPT was saying, oh, certain classes are non what's the word? They're not optional. They're mandatory. I'm like, it's my kid. You can't tell me something's like mandatory, legally mandatory for my kid, and then they want to introduce or are introducing this register for homeschooling. You have to get permission if you want to homeschool your kid, which makes my blood boil. But again, I don't know if it's conspiracy. I think it might be, but I think it's more just the state the government wants to govern, that's its role, that's its job, and it just keeps expanding and expanding.
Or whether it's organized or accidental, the outcome is the same.
Hmm. Yes.
I mean, there's a quote I love coming back to, which I came via the computer game Civ, which is the bureaucracy is expanding to meet the needs of the expanding bureaucracy. So it's like a snake eating its own tail.
Hmm.
So
Yes.
to
Yeah.
mix a few metaphors there.
Have you read the book Priceless?
William Poundstone.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an excellent book. I think it's in that book. I seem to remember that he was saying that the best time to market something is when people are in a state of when they're kind of happy. So that's why when you go to the
Mm.
cinema, the adverts in the cinema, you're excited about watching a film, or and therefore those adverts will resonate more. And adverts around the holidays as well, which when people are kind of generally in a good mood, it's much easier to sell to them. So there's two sides to that, isn't there? There's the fear side that makes people fear of missing out. So we see the kind of time clock going, you've got to buy now, or that's limited, or all that sort of stuff. And then you've also got the, oh, everyone's happy, we can sell to them at this point.
Yeah, I know the stock market does better when the weather is nice as well, for instance. And it's also stock market performance has been tied to public sentiment on Twitter in some research. So yeah, the happier people are, the more they're kind of buying. But on the other hand, we are loss averse, so losing something hurts about twice as much as winning something. So if you lose £50, the sting of that is twice as big as the joy of winning £50. Um, and so
Absolutely.
we do have a negativity bias. We have a tendency to be more influenced by the negative, which of course you see in the news, right? Happy news. I mean, no, I don't think any news publications report on happy stories anymore, but if they did, they probably wouldn't really go that viral. I remember when the news used to have kind of fluff piece at the end about a dog that was a mayor or something, but now it's just it's all kind of negative because that's what people click on, that's what they engage with.
But the perverse thing is that someone, I forget his name, one of the anchors tried to introduce a good news channel. It completely flopped.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm guilty of it too. When I'm stressed, I might go on Twitter and waste time there just doom scrolling because as unpleasant as it is,
It's
it's
more compelling.
distracting. It's more compelling. There's this kind of dopamine hit of that negative emotion. It also
Well,
kind of
there are also cute animals, though. To be fair, so
yes,
there's
that's
probably
true.
first scrolling.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
So, Patrick, your book Hooked. Tell us about that and what we could learn from it if we bought it.
So Hooked was a marketing psychology book about how to make messages more effective, really. So it's about how to, first of all, grab attention through, as I said, things like cuteness, fear. Uh, I saw an FT ad that had sharks in it once, very effective for me at least. I'm terrified of sharks, but fear, surprise, personalization, all of these things which we're hardwired to pay attention to. And then the second part of the book is about how to make that message then stick. And there's a few things that work there, but it's essentially about getting people to process the message more easily and more richly, I suppose. So one of the things is fluency, so making things as simple as possible. Good, or at least an effective or skillful example of this is hands, face, space. If you remember
Mm.
the COVID messaging, because it used the rule of three and it used rhyming, which are good rhetorical techniques to make something sticky, but these are also three very short and simple words. They're also concrete words, which means they're visualizable. So they didn't say hygiene, which is abstract. They said hands, which are tangible things. Um, a bit like how Trump talks about building a wall rather than outlining a complex policy, because a wall is literally concrete and you can see it in your head. Um, then there's also stories. Stories are effective ways of communicating because they make you feel something empathetically rather than just see it kind of superficially and lightly. You actually feel it. And also, stories have suspense points where you want to find out what the answer is, what happens at the end, which
But
is
it,
how all or most art works really. So jokes, for example, have a setup and a punchline, and they're acting on that curiosity gap, that suspense of the working out how the punchline meets the setup. Music often sets up patterns, then breaks them a bit, and that causes a bit of tension in your head. Stories have conflict and resolution. Um, and that's the third principle, which makes something sticky, is curiosity. So that's mystery, puzzles, things which don't quite make sense at first, and you have to work them out a little bit. And then the third part of the book is then how do you make that message persuasive and change behavior? And basically that's through nudges, which we touched on earlier. But I'll give you another good COVID or good masterful COVID example is this text which went out for the vaccine, where in just 19 words they managed to fit at least six nudges in a text. And those 19 words were, you have reached the top of the queue and are a priority for getting a free NHS COVID vaccine. So by saying there's a queue, they're using social proof. It's popular, so it must be good. By saying you've reached the top, they're using commitment bias, where if you feel invested in something, like you've been waiting in line, you don't want to lose your place. By saying you've reached the top of the queue is probably an ego nudge to make you feel a bit special. By saying your priority, that maybe an ego nudge, but also probably scarcity. So you feel like demand is bigger than supply, so you feel that urge to go and get it. Giving it for free is about making it as easy as possible, but maybe also reciprocity nudge. So you feel like you're being given something, so you feel a bit obligated to do what they're asking. And then having it come explicitly from the NHS is a messenger effect where you're more likely to do something if the message comes from someone you like or trust. So that's what Hooked is about, really, grabbing attention, being sticky and changing behavior.
But the messages don't always work. I mean, one is bound to think of "Build Back Better," which is a
Hmm.
phrase that every big politician with links to the World Economic Forum was using, but it's almost sort of ungrammatical
Yeah.
Asian sort of Chinese-esque formed nonsense. Nobody in English speaks like that. So as if it
Yeah.
was like a script written by foreigners, and then everyone was beaten into having to repeat it all day long.
Or a bit like those car names which like Qashqai, which don't really mean anything, but they're designed to be acceptable to all languages.
Yeah.
Ah, okay. Because I saw a Qashqai the other day, and they've been around for a while. But as you say, it presumably is a word that doesn't actually really exist. But then Metro,
Mm.
Montego.
Well,
There was once a time when
the
all of that range had to have the letters M and O at the beginning and the end, didn't they?
well, there was the classic Nova, the Vauxhall Nova,
Doesn't go.
which means doesn't go. Which is like, I think that's why they've been a bit more
But
careful.
the Latin American sales weren't tip top.
No, exactly. Patrick, I wanted to ask whether I know we're running towards the end of the time that we've got with you, and I was thinking, could you write a headline for this podcast to make it clickable? And I wanted to give you a little bit of time just in case,
16 words, and we want nine nudges.
just in case you didn't have time to do it, because I also want to get onto your book about AI that's coming out. So I just wanted a bit of time. Would that be possible?
Yeah, I'll have a think. I'm an introvert, so I can't do it on the spot, but
Ah, okay, okay.
I'll sit in the
We'll give you
quiet
a few. We'll
room
give you a few minutes.
Okay, no, that's great. If you, yeah, of course you could do it afterwards. Yeah, that would be
I
brilliant.
don't know what's the most salacious thing I've said, and then
I could give you a transcript afterwards if you like. I don't think. Yeah, I'll send you a link to it, and then
I would
maybe we could
nominate the phrase "fur scrolling."
that was
yeah.
you though. That was you.
Doesn't matter. It's a one happy team.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're. I was going to ask what have you got in the future? What are you up to? But I can see that there's a book on the way, Tech Gods, which sounds very prescient. Tell us a bit about that and what you hope to readers to get from it.
So I'm in the early stages of writing this new book, Tech Gods, which is about how technology is kind of creating a new God. And if you think about God, typically there's two features, omniscience and omnipotent, so all-knowing and all-powerful. And so the book, first of all, is about how this technology, um, I'm trying to kind of personify it, so I call it the machine. But the machine is all-knowing in that it has all of these data points it's collecting on us at all times of the day. And also, these data points can be used to predict other things about us and kind of read our minds. So um, there was that famous Facebook-like study where, yes, they could predict people's personality from what they like on Facebook, but it could also predict sexuality, drug use, alcohol use, whether or not their parents were divorced.
Wow.
And this was years ago, actually, the study. It's just getting more sophisticated since then. So it can read our minds in essence. And then it's omnipotent in that it's increasingly in charge of all kind of aspects of our life. And even people use ChatGPT so much, they're basically outsourcing their brains to it now. But also, people have been debanked for political views. We saw this with the Canadian truckers for their protests. They had kind of their bank accounts frozen, for instance. Um, there's the online safety law in the UK, which I agree with parts of it, but in general, having to prove your identity to do things on the internet is probably not a good move. But it's just making, anyway, the machine more powerful. And then the third part of the book is about transcendence, which is almost a spiritual aspect of technology. And the really interesting thing I'm exploring is this idea of what's called, in old school terms, it's called an egregore, but in more rational terms, you could call it kind of a mind virus or an infodemic. But technology is essentially hollowing us out. It's making us more fluid, as we talked about, less connected to and anchored to things. And this creates kind of a vacuum in people where they can be kind of taken over, possessed, if you like, by ideas which come from the internet. And so you're seeing these kind of groups coalesce and form now that they're connected by the internet. I mean, you could talk about certain trends on TikTok, for example, political movements. On the right wing, you can talk about QAnon, which is basically, obviously there are elements of truth to all things, including QAnon, but a lot of it is just psychosis, really, internet psychosis. And uh, that's it. And the main is that it knows everything, it controls our behavior more, and also it's got this spiritual side to it. But the fourth part of the book is resistance, which is what you can do about it.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. I was going to say, what can we do about it? But I suppose other than just keeping off it, there must be some other techniques which will be really interesting to explore. When do you think that will be available, approximately?
Next year, hopefully.
Okay, excellent stuff. Excellent. So, Tim, was there anything else you wanted to ask just before we wrap up?
Not for this one, but I think I essentially only scratched the surface of this topic.
100%. Patrick, was there anything that we should have asked you that you wanted to mention?
No, I just think if we're talking about markets, then for me, The Fourth Turning was kind of a life-changing book, especially thinking about how trust comes and goes in cycles and how money, at least fiat currency, is basically trust. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that book if people have not read it.
Fantastic. I know you've got a 10 o'clock, so I'm going to end it here and just say thank you so much for coming on the pod. It's been really interesting, an absolute pleasure, and we hope to have you back.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. You can find out more about Patrick at patrickfagan.co.uk. His Twitter handle is pfagan87. That's PFAGAN 87. And of course, as usual, we'll put all links in the show notes. Thanks, everybody. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. Please do your own research or contact a professional advisor.